Gaming reviews done quick, because we put Pegasus boots on this thing. Welcome to the 1 Minute Rundown. I'm OC Trinity, your host, and judging by my view counts, I'm still a secret to everybody. This time, we're running down Part 1 of Legend of Zelda. Trying to do all of these in one show is going to take too long, so I'm just covering the two-dimensional games here. It's been called by many reputable sources as the greatest game series ever, to the point that probably everyone who's ever held a game controller has played at least one of these before. If you're one of the poor souls who hasn't, most of these are adventure games with a balance between action, exploration, and puzzle solving. You'll take the role of Link on his quest, which usually, but not always, involves defeating the evil Ganon, rescuing Princess Zelda, and recovering an ancient artifact called the Triforce. Along the way, you'll search through some temples and dungeons, which usually contain a new weapon or skill and a plot-related item to keep the adventure going. Yeah, it's been around long enough that some of these are a bit formulaic, but hey, the formula works. It's also a series where everyone seems to have a favorite, so let's get to the review and hopefully not bash your favorite. I don't think there's much arguing over the influence on gaming this had, as it's essentially the game that made non-linearity a big deal. Nor do I think there's much arguing that it had a different approach than the sequels that followed, in that you were just dropped into the world with almost no indication of where to go, there's very few restrictions on what order you can complete each location, and an almost complete lack of storyline beyond what's presented in the prologue. Also, most puzzle solving is more along the lines of deciphering vague riddles, though some of these end up being so vague I'm not sure how some of them could reasonably be expected to be finished without blind trial and error. So if you like heavy exploration elements, this is probably going to be one of your favorites, and the variety you'll see in enemy types is also pretty solid, but despite all of that, age has caught up to it some. Control does feel a little stiff since there's no diagonal movement, there's a few repeated bosses, and again there's several points where it feels like you couldn't proceed without assumed knowledge. Even though later games have definitely improved on the formula, I still have little doubt that if you got into the series later on, you'll still enjoy looking at how it all got started. Back in the days of the NES, the idea of video game sequels wasn't quite standardized yet, and that led to this, the black sheep of the series, if you will. It's converted to a platform game with combat that leans heavily towards blocking and striking a weak point. It also adds a light experience point system, and it's the first game in the series that included magic spells. And honestly, it's pretty easy to hate on just because of how unlike the rest of the series it is, so let it be known that I'm not even going to consider that dissimilarity when I say that of all the Legend of Zelda games, this is probably the one you can most afford to skip. By around the halfway point, leveling up takes a ridiculous amount of grinding, or at least a near-deathless run for a long period of time, something already made difficult by high difficulty level. I mean, by the end it reaches a point where the reflexes the game's expecting are so demanding you're practically guessing. In other words, this is more hard by being unfair. It's also extremely easy to get lost in the dungeons since there's some heavy copy-pasting on them. The ideas put forth here are actually good, they're just not executed that well. Here we'll go back to the formula used by the first game, except with significant improvements to the point that later games essentially use this one as their starting point. There's also a dual world concept here, as the second half of the game sees Link move back and forth through the Dark World, a chaotic, twisted, parallel world similar to Hyrule as we know it, but with enough changes to keep it interesting. But everything else just seems like they've upped the ante on, well, everything. I mean, in terms of content, I could make a case there's actually more here than a lot of the newer games. There's more dungeons to explore than most of the other Zelda games, but rather than use exclusive concepts, they just keep adding on to each other, getting some very complex but excellent design by the end. Link collects one of his highest quantities of items, nearly all of which remain useful throughout the adventure, and the amount of secrets is higher than you would expect too. Honestly, I'm struggling to write my dialogue for this review because I just can't come up with much to complain about. Really, this is one of those games I'll jump back to periodically for fun, and it ranks among the best games I've ever played. A lot of games on handhelds tend to be thought of as unnecessarily downsized compared to their console counterparts, and this is one game that shows it really doesn't have to be like this, and surprisingly, it doesn't get there by throwing out new and creative design concepts. I mean, this game doesn't really use too many concepts exclusive to this game particularly, and about the most significant one that did become part of the Zelda tradition is the idea of a long trading sequence that eventually leads to a very useful item, though one actually needed to finish this game, and the ability to assign 2 items to a button instead of just one, in this case meaning you can unequip your sword. Instead, we'll just take the best concepts from the previous 3 games and stitch them together in a way that everything flows together seamlessly. Essentially, we're taking the game flow standardized by Link to the Past, but adding a few elements from the first 2 games. This time around, each location does seem to have a central theme around it, and the variety you'll see is more than you'd expect, even considering the relatively small collection of items in this game. The end result, simply put, is one of the better games in this series. Go for it. I'm going to break away from my usual 1 minute per game format this time because these two games need to be discussed in tandem. See, they're two completely different games with completely different world, story, and item selection, but they run on the same engine, the one from Link's Awakening specifically, and link together some. After finishing one game, you'll get a password to start the other as a continued storyline and an upgraded character, among a few other bonuses. It's pretty clear these were intended to be played together, as both have a lot in common. Both feature an accessory system seen in most JRPGs, equip one to get a few support effects, and for that matter you'll see a handful of characters that appear in both games, and not too surprisingly some overlap in the items you'll get. Oracle of Ages has a loose time travel theme, frequently shifting between two different time frames using mechanics similar to the Dark World concept in Link to the Past. Compared to Seasons, it has dungeons that tend to revolve more around puzzles. Oracle of Seasons, on the other hand, has a world based around spring, summer, fall, and winter being out of order and placement, and changing the season will also change the landscape some. Waters recede or freeze over, leaves or snow pile up, plants bloom, and so on. It also puts a lot less emphasis on puzzles, instead going more towards raw action. And all else left aside, whether or not I'd have my skill dependent on brain power or reflex would probably depend more on how I'm feeling that day, and Ages does get a more interesting storyline, but I do have a slight preference for Seasons, due to a better paced and more creative game. In terms of the rest of the series, though, I also think this is one of the more overlooked games as far as in terms of quality. It's right on par with the rest of the handhelds, but at the same time, I can't help but feel this is sort of a rehash, as there's so much that looks, feels, and plays too much like Link's Awakening to stand out on its own. Nonetheless, I have little doubt that fans who can't get enough of that game will still enjoy this one. We'll call this the other black sheep in the series, as this one's actually got a more arcade-like multiplayer-driven feel due to Link being split into 4 separate characters. The game consists entirely of 24 isolated levels, each of which start the 4 Links with no special skills and with the goal of reaching the end of a level with at least 2,000 Force Gems. It's written around the idea of simultaneous co-op and versus multiplayer. See, only one Link can grab a particular item, and attacking your own teammates is allowed and possibly encouraged due to a side objective of being the player who collects the most Force Gems. But there's a lot of puzzles and concepts that explicitly require teamwork or trust, too. So unless you can trust all of your friends to play the same way, and every one of them has a Game Boy Advance to connect to the GameCube, you're more likely going solo. So then the question becomes, does it hold up as a single-player game? And much to my surprise, the answer is yes. In single-player, you're simultaneously controlling all 4 Links with the option to change formations or switch to individual control. And while this means some segments take longer to finish in single-player, it still works well enough to make this worthy of your collection, too. This game is essentially an origin story for the 4 Swords story arc, but it doesn't use the multiple link concept outside of a few puzzles in the second half of the game. Instead, the gameplay style is heavily reminiscent of the other Game Boy Zelda games. The Minish Cap, the actual item, is a hat that shrinks the wearer to minuscule size, which expands or restricts movement pretty much how you would expect. Par for the course, your regular standard size enemies are sometimes upgraded bosses when you're Minish size, but the game's creative about how it pulls this off too. Side objectives, for the most part, are governed this time by kinstones, a metal broken into 2 halves, and finding the person with the other half will unlock something somewhere else. Collecting everything here would require some very thorough exploration, but there's a lot of leeway here as to how much you'll actually need, and the world's fairly compact. There's not a lot of lost time going around the world map. My only real complaint here is that there are a few slow points between new locations, but beyond that I don't have much bad to say here. I've always thought this was one of the more underrated games in the series, and if you're a Zelda fan and missed out on this one before, by all means track this one down. And we'll stop there for part 1 of Zelda. Nintendo tells us there are 16 official games in the series, the rest of which will be covered in another episode. Except most likely this game, 4 Swords. I haven't checked it out yet, but from what I can tell, it's essentially a smaller, multiplayer-only version of 4 Swords Adventures. That one also came along with a port of Link to the Past, and Link's Awakening got a colorized remake too. Almost all these are also on at least some form of the Virtual Console as well, or have been announced to show up later, and the cartridge form I was able to find on Amazon for around the $20 to $30 range. If you're lucky, you might also find a collector's edition that contains both NES and both N64 games, but given its cost now, unless you have none of these already, you're probably just better off searching for them individually. As for the future of the series, well, new games have been announced for both the Wii U and the 3DS. The 3DS outing is a direct sequel to Link to the Past and looks to borrow a lot of gameplay directly from that. If my review of that game was any indication, this one will be worth talking about too. Either way, it's clear this series has too much potential and popularity to be left alone for more than a couple years at a time. Check back in a couple weeks for the next episode of 1 Minute Rundown. Zelda has a few games that went off the usual mechanic, but the series we'll cover next time had a game that went so far off the rails it's accused of killing off the whole series. So, until next time, remember, it's dangerous to go alone.
Later, on Part 2 of Legend of Zelda, the Demon King fights back using his dark magic to make their monster grow. Fortunately, Link still has an ace up his sleeve. Can the long-sleeping giant...
What do you mean this isn't a Sentai series? What's wrong with it if it gets us more viewers? I mean, we're trying not to be a secret from everybody. You know what, just get the producer on the line. We gotta find some other way to keep this interesting.